Good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. I'm going to begin by putting what Waj has been talking about into a slightly more personal framework and telling you a little bit about the work that I've done, if I can find my way to my presentation. Okay. So as I was introduced by Zara at the beginning, my name is Julia MacFarlane. I'm a law professor from Canada, that country, you know, up there to the north. And I also teach at the University of Notre Dame at the Peace Studies Institute. And I think the first question that I need to try to answer to you this afternoon is, what is a nice British non-Muslim law professor girl doing speaking on a panel about the anti-Sharia movement? Because I think that will give you a little bit of insight into my work and what I'm doing here. I have been a dispute resolution scholar for about 25 years. That's the work that I've done as an academic and also as a practitioner. And I became interested about 6 years ago by a huge media firestorm that was going on in Ontario, which is the province of Canada in which I live, over the apparent threat of Sharia law coming to Ontario, sort of a reflection of what you've been hearing for the last 45 minutes. And I was intrigued by what this really meant, because every time I read something in the newspaper or heard something on the radio, none of it actually contained any concrete information about what this Sharia was that was being practiced in mosques and why we should all be so scared about it. So I decided it would be useful to collect some empirical data to actually find out what was meant by Sharia and the processes that were being talked about, mostly centering on family conflicts that were apparently so scary. So I managed to get a good research grant to help me do this study, and found my way through various friends and colleagues and former students, different parts of the Muslim communities, first of all in the Greater Toronto area, then in other parts of Canada, and then throughout the United States. And I conducted a 4-year study, during which time I interviewed more than 200 people, many imams, men and women, Muslim men and women who had used Islamic family processes to be married and to be divorced, and also a range of other individuals who were knowledgeable about the use of these processes, social workers, therapists, lawyers, and so forth. And that's what my book is about, Islamic Divorce in North America. And I have a couple of copies with me today if anybody is interested. And yes, I suppose I do profit from it. You see, you've shown me up now. But I can sell it to you at my author's discount, so there you go. So what I want to begin by just spending a couple of moments on is this. When I first started to do this study, I knew nothing really about Islam. I was educated in the United Kingdom in the 1960s, and believe me, we did not learn about other religions. I grew up in a household which was notionally Christian, but we didn't practice any faith. So when I began in on this, I had absolutely no idea of what I was going to encounter. I was just very curious. I almost instantly realized as I started to look on the internet that there was an enormous amount of hatred being peddled and paranoia being peddled around Muslims in America, and this idea that Sharia was somehow creeping into American public life. And I was deeply shocked by that. But again, I didn't know anything. I had no kind of location for this. I was simply encountering it over and over again. Then, as I started to discuss with my academic colleagues, my friends, the fact that I was engaging on this new research project, which was effectively going to take over, release me from my teaching for the next 4 years, I started to get all kinds of very surprising reactions. Why are you studying that? I thought you were a feminist. And you mean there is such a thing as divorce in Islam? I thought they just stoned the women. Raucous laughter. You know, I can't tell you how many times I have sat at a dinner table or in a faculty common room hearing these kinds of comments from people who are highly educated and sophisticated. And this shocked me to my core, because what was clear was that in this particular area, there seems to be a widespread moral certainty, which is based upon absolutely no information whatsoever. And it's extraordinary how, when, as Waj was saying at the end of his speech, there is a particular group that is targeted for public hatred, we have an extraordinary amount of certainty about it, even though we may have no actual concrete information. And this really shocked me, because I would have expected some of those attitudes and some of what we've been hearing about for the last 30 minutes in a larger public context, but I didn't expect to hear it in universities. I didn't expect to hear it amongst people who were my respected colleagues. And it's encapsulated in a student who came to another colleague of mine, a law student, and said during the time of the Ontario so-called debate that he wanted to write an essay about Sharia law. And my colleague said to him, "What do you know about Sharia?" And he said, "Well, nothing, but I know it's a really bad thing." And the idea that we could have people, with such access to information and learning who will still begin with such moral certainty, I think is a deeply shocking thing. So what does this mean? What I'm going to do today is I'm going to use my time to talk about some of the innumerable misconceptions that I encountered in the course of my research. And I'm going to try to illustrate why they are misconceptions with some data from my research. And I suppose what I would really like to leave with you today, because this really does reflect my own journey in this particular work, is knowing that there is Islamophobia out there and knowing that there is widespread lack of knowledge, yet moral certainty, is not sufficient for those of us who are aware of the fallacy and the intentionality of some of these constructions. I think it's really important, and what I would really like to happen is that everybody who leaves here today leaves with a little bit more information, a little bit more knowledge, so that the next time at the dinner table somebody laughs about how all the women in Islam who want divorce get stoned, you have something concrete to say back that is really based on some empirical data and some well-informed knowledge. So, Sharia law is coming. This was actually a billboard at my turnoff. I go to Detroit to fly most places, and there's a billboard on I-94 that had this up there for probably about 2 years while I was doing this research. It was somewhat ironic. Sharia law is coming, it told me. Another choice quote, it isn't Islamophobia when they are really trying to kill you. There are many, many of these examples. The truth about Islam: intolerance, slaughter, looting, arson, molestation of women. And a final example, says the first person, do you know what flag this is? Pointing to the Union Jack. Yes, it was the British flag before Britain became an Islamic republic. I mean, it's crazy stuff, right? We know that. So we know, and this is something that Leanne is going to elaborate further upon, that 26 US states have now sought to introduce anti-Sharia legislation, Oklahoma being the very first, but we have seen it in many other states. In a couple of these states it's been successful. The breadth and the scope, which I know Leanne is going to say some more about, of some of these anti-Sharia amendments is quite breathtaking. They began by using the template that had been developed, which basically said that the courts would be prohibited from referring to any other systems of law. It fairly quickly became apparent that the courts couldn't function if they couldn't refer to any other systems of law, so it became more specific about Sharia. But in a couple of places, there was quite a lot additionally added. So, for example, in Tennessee, the original proposal suggested that the Attorney General should designate groups of 2 or more people who adhere to Sharia law as Sharia organizations, and making the act of knowingly providing material support or resources to such organization would be a crime punishable with 15 years in prison. So any group of 2 or more people who adhere to Sharia law becomes Sharia organizations, and anybody who assists them or provides them with any material resources is subject to a 15-year prison term. Now, this fell out of the bill at an earlier stage, but it gives you a sense of just how extreme some of these efforts were to designate these groups. And again, in Tennessee, reflecting something that we've seen in really all of these anti-Sharia efforts, the assertion that Sharia requires all its adherents to actively support the replacement of America's constitutional republic, including the representative government of this state with a political system based upon Sharia. And I'm going to talk now about some of the clear fallacies and misconceptions that lie behind this. And I'm going to do it in the form of 5 misconceptions. I always have a really hard time with this because there are actually about 50 or even 500 misconceptions, but I'm going to try and boil it down to 5. And as I said, I'm going to try to use some of my data to illustrate each one to you. First misconception. American Muslims want Sharia publicly imposed and enforced on other Muslims and on non-Muslims. That's the implication of Sharia law is coming. It's coming to get you. That was the implication of what was happening in Ontario, that everybody had to be afraid that Sharia was coming. As we have already heard, in fact, Sharia is a matter of private conscience, not public enforcement. And I didn't interview anybody who wanted Sharia or even could make sense of the statement, should Sharia be imposed upon others. If it's a matter of private conscience, it's a matter for the private conscience of every individual Muslim. It's not something that is a matter of compulsion. And most certainly, it's not something that should be or could be in any way that makes any kind of sense imposed upon non-Muslims. It's a matter between the individual and God, as one of many, many people described it to me. And the respondents in my study were very clear and consistent that they could distinguish between their private obligations, their obligations as Muslim, as Waj was describing before, to find the ways and the types of behaviors that they felt would make them good Muslims, and their public duties, their duties in the public sphere as citizens. I started my study by asking everybody that I interviewed, were they interested in a parallel system of Islamic tribunals or Sharia tribunals, because this was what had sparked the initial controversy in Ontario. And it was so interesting because this seemed to me to be a perfectly logical thing to ask because it was what everybody was so worried about. I had an excellent, a wonderful research assistant who worked with me, a Muslim Canadian woman, and about 2 or 3 months into our interviews, Aisha came to me and said, please can we stop asking people that question? I feel like such an idiot. Because every time we ask people, would it be important to you to have your divorce processed by a separate parallel tribunal that then could be recognized in a court of law in Ontario, could give it validity within that public law system, they would just look at me as if this was a nonsensical question that they couldn't compute. And then they would try to explain to me, it doesn't make any difference to me if a court in Ontario recognizes my divorce or my marriage. We're talking about a private matter for me as a Muslim, a process or a ritual or a procedure in relation to both marriage and divorce that I will do privately with my family that makes me feel as if I am following Sharia and doing what God would want. Whether or not a court in Ontario would recognize that is completely beside the point. Why would I need a court in Ontario to recognize that? So the question itself was nonsensical. And as we did drop the question. I did accede to Aisha's request, and we stopped asking people. I also asked the imams, were they interested in, what you could maybe cynically see as empire building, having their own system, having their own separate and parallel system, because once again, this was very much the impression that was created by the media. I even interviewed a number of imams who were cited in the media as being supportive of a separate Islamic tribunal system that would be recognized in the public courts. All but 3 of the imams that I spoke to said they had no interest whatsoever in a separate private system. Many of them said, in fact, they thought it would be very dangerous for the Muslim community to have a separate system. Far better to be integrated into the public system, for Muslims to use the public system, perhaps for that system to be a little bit more understanding and recognizing of the values and the procedures that were important to Muslims. And of all of the imams that I interviewed, just 3 who said that they did think there might be some value in a separate Islamic tribunal system. And of those 3, none of them would have seen that as taking precedence over the public courts, simply that there would be a private system. Next misconception, and again we've heard a little bit about this already, that Sharia is some single fixed legal code. As Waj said, this isn't a book you can go check out of the library. This is something which is constantly developing and which is very much part of people's own sense of private conscience. On the other hand, some of Sharia is designated as fiqh, as Islamic law, as we've also heard. And this is the part that is concerned with behaviors that can be regulated. You know, a lot of what Muslims see as Sharia isn't something that you could possibly have regulation on in any case. You know, how many times you speak to God a day is not something that can actually be policed and monitored. Whether or not you really do complete your fast is not something that can be policed and monitored. So in actual fact, it's only certain dimensions of Sharia that are even susceptible to any kind of enforcement process. And I think that it's actually extremely important that we understand the difference between Sharia, the broader private conscience that Muslims will adopt, which will be unique to each of them, and this idea of something that is enforceable as law, because of course the conflation of the word Sharia and law, which is what we see all the time, as in the billboard, Sharia law is coming, is part of what fuels public fear, because it sounds so rigid, it sounds so authoritarian. In actual fact, there is no such thing as Sharia law. There is Sharia, and then as a subset of Sharia, there is Islamic law concerned with particular kinds of behavior. And, you know, it's important to realize that those kinds of behaviors in modern Islamic legal codes are almost entirely concerned with family law matters, which is why I came back to studying the processes of marriage and divorce. And I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. One of the imams that I interviewed told me, really close to the beginning of the study actually, there is a Sharia for every Muslim. And this really kind of blew my mind, because I was still struggling with this idea that I had begun with, that there really was some kind of fixed structure here. But as time went on, I understood that at a deeper and deeper level, because many of the people that I interviewed would not have considered themselves to be particularly religiously observant. In fact, they would have described themselves as fairly secular. Yet, there were certain things that were still very important to them. And amongst the things that were very important to them as Muslims were the ways in which they became married and the ways in which they were divorced, which I'll say a little bit more about in a moment. The one other thing I want to say, though, before I leave this slide is this. You know, part of what is so challenging about explaining some of these issues to other people is that the present age in which we have so many different sources for debate and discussion and information and knowledge via the World Wide Web has completely transformed any kind of debate about Sharia. You know, if you go back to before the internet age, you will see that in the Islamic world there were particular scholars and there were particular jurists who had credibility and authority when it came to talking about what was Sharia. Now, Sharia, just like every other ideology or religious creed or any other kind of belief system, is now subject to a technological expansion beyond anybody's imagination. So if you go on the internet, you'll find all kinds of different sites that claim to answer questions about Sharia in response to people who write in and say, you know, am I allowed to have oral sex as a Muslim? Am I properly divorced from my husband if I haven't slept with him for 3 weeks? And very authoritative answers come back all the time. And this is not something I'm sure that the 7th century contemplated. It's not even something that I necessarily contemplated when I first began my academic career, and it has completely changed how we think about this idea of a Sharia for every Muslim. Now, there really is the possibility that people can find ways to explain and understand their different versions of their private conscience and find validation for it in all kinds of sources.